I don't even know why I'm writing this down. Maybe it's just to make sense of what happened. Maybe it's to warn someone else or myself. I haven't slept in 2 days. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it. The faint creak of a door, the steady drip of water, the sound of my name whispered in the dark. It all started 3 nights ago when I decided to take a road trip to clear my head. A breakup, a job I hated, and a nagging sense that I was just drifting through life. I needed an escape. Driving through open highways with no clear destination seemed like the best way to reset. The first 2 days were uneventful. I'd stop at diners for cheap coffee, crank up the radio, and lose myself in the endless stretch of road. By the third evening, I was tired, my legs stiff from sitting so long. I spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. Vacancy, Moonrise Motel. It wasn't much to look at peeling paint on the walls, a parking lot with more cracks than asphalt, but it was cheap, and I wasn't in the mood to be picky. The receptionist was an older woman with sharp features and a voice like gravel. She barely looked at me as she slid the key across the counter. "Room 12, she said. "End of the row." "Thanks," I muttered, grabbing the key. Her gaze lingered on me for a second too long, her eyes cold and calculating. I brushed it off as exhaustion and stepped back into the cool night air. The room smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning chemicals. A single bed with a scratchy floral comforter took up most of the space. The TV was one of those old tube models, the kind I hadn't seen since I was a kid. A tiny bathroom with a flickering fluorescent light completed the picture. It wasn't cozy, but it would do for a night. After a quick shower, I collapsed onto the bed, scrolling through my phone until my eyes grew heavy. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a faint creak, like someone shifting their weight on an old floorboard. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, barely loud enough to hear, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The parking lot was empty except for my car and a rusted pickup a few spaces down. Telling myself it was probably just the wind or a prank, I locked the deadbolt and crawled back into bed. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of dripping water. Groggy, I stumbled into the bathroom, expecting to find a leaky faucet. Instead, I found the shower curtain pulled open, the shower head dripping steadily. I was certain I'd left it closed. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I hadn't shut it all the way. I turned the faucet tightly and went back to bed. That's when I noticed something I couldn't explain. The chair by the window, the one I'd seen earlier sitting neatly by the desk, was now facing the bed. The rest of the night passed in fits of restless sleep, punctuated by strange noises I couldn't place. By morning, I was eager to get out of there. I packed my bag, tossed the key on the reception counter, and didn't even wait for the old woman to show up. Back on the road, I felt a little better. The sunlight, the familiar hum of my car, the open road, it was enough to convince me the night before had been nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. That relief didn't last long. About an hour into my drive, I glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly swerved off the road. There, in the back seat, was the chair from the motel room. My heart stopped. I slammed on the brakes, pulling onto the shoulder. I turned around, my breath shallow and ragged, but the back seat was empty. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a fragment of a bad dream I couldn't quite shake. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. Still, I kept driving, refusing to stop until I reached a larger town with chain motels and busy streets. By the time I checked into the new motel, I was exhausted. The room was bland and impersonal beige walls, generic artwork, a clean bed, but I welcomed the normalcy. That night, I didn't hear any strange noises. No creaking floorboards, no dripping water. But when I woke up around 3 a.m., there was something new, a faint, almost imperceptible hum. It sounded like static, like an old TV left on a dead channel. I turned on the lamp and scanned the room. The TV was off. The sound was coming from the bathroom. I stepped closer, the hum growing louder, almost deafening. My hand trembled as I pushed open the bathroom door. The mirror was fogged up, even though I hadn't used the shower, and on its surface, written in shaky, dripping letters, was a single word: steak. I bolted out of there, leaving my bag behind. I didn't care about the money or my belongings, I just needed to get out. I drove through the night, fueled by adrenaline and fear, stopping only when daylight broke. I thought I'd escaped whatever it was, but now, 2 days later, I know better. The noises have followed me home. The creaks, the whispers, the faint hum, they're all here. And last night, I woke up to find my bedroom chair facing my bed. I don't know what's happening. I don't know why it chose me. But I can feel it getting closer, like it's waiting for me to slip, to let my guard down. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever see a sign for the Moonrise Motel, keep driving, don't stop, don't look back, and whatever you do, don't stay the night. I didn't mean to stop at that motel. I really didn't. It was late around 1 a.m. and the rain had been relentless for hours, hammering the windshield in thick sheets. I could barely see the road ahead, the high beams doing little more than illuminating the downpour. I'd been driving for hours trying to make it to my sister's place across the state. I hadn't planned on stopping, but exhaustion was creeping in and every mile felt heavier than the last. When the glowing red vacancy sign appeared through the rain, it felt like an invitation. A small, tired-looking roadside motel. One of those L-shaped ones with flickering neon lights and a dimly lit office. The kind of place that probably hadn't been updated since the 70 seconds. I don't even remember pulling in. One moment I was driving and the next I was in a small gravel lot, the rain pounding on the roof of the car. I should have kept going, but I didn't. The office bell jingled as I stepped inside, the smell of stale air and cigarette smoke filling my nose. A small desk with a rusted fan sat in the corner, and behind it, an old man with pale skin and eyes that didn't seem to blink. "Room for one?" His voice was gravelly low. I nodded, pulling out my wallet, just for the night. He didn't say much after that, just handed me a key attached to a cracked plastic fob. Room 12, far end of the lot. I thanked him and stepped back out into the rain. The motel stretched out along the lot, the room numbers barely visible in the dim light. My room was the second to last. The curtains were drawn and the window was dark. I felt uneasy almost immediately. The door creaked as I unlocked it and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a damp, musty scent, like old carpet that had been soaked and left to dry on its own. The room was basic. A single bed with a faded floral bedspread, a wooden dresser with a bulky old TV sitting on top, and a small table by the window. I tossed my bag on the bed and collapsed into the chair by the table, rubbing my eyes. I needed sleep, but something about the room felt wrong. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I hadn't slept much the night before, and my nerves were fried from driving in the rain. I locked the door, double-checked the window, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The rain hammered against the glass, drowning out most other sounds. But underneath it so faint I almost didn't hear it was something else. A creak, like footsteps somewhere above me. I glanced at the ceiling. As far as I could tell, the motel didn't have a second floor. I listened for a minute, straining to hear over the rain, but the sound didn't come again. I chalked it up to pipes or the wind shifting something outside. I turned on the TV. Static. Static. I flipped through the channels, but everyone was the same, just empty static hissing into the room. I turned it off, leaving only the rain and the faint hum of the ceiling light. As I lay back on the bed, I stared at the ceiling, trying to let the noise lull me to sleep, but I couldn't. Something felt off. I sat up, rubbing the back of my neck. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service. Figures. A storm like this always killed the signal. I sighed and got up to check the window. The rain had lessened to a light drizzle, but the parking lot was empty except for my car. Even the office lights had gone out. That's when I saw it. Faint, just beyond the edge of the lot, a figure stood by the tree line. At first I thought it was my imagination. The shadows were deep and the figure barely moved, blending into the darkness. But as I stared, I could make out the shape, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. I blinked. It was gone. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding in my chest. "Calm down," I muttered to myself. "You're just tired." But something felt. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up, listening. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving only silence behind. And then I heard it again, the creak. But this time, it was closer. I sat up, barely breathing, listening as the sound shifted, slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the walkway outside my room. They stopped right outside my door. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stared at the gap beneath the door, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. A shadow passed across the crack, blocking out the faint light from outside for just a moment. I held my breath. Seconds passed. Maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. Then the footsteps started again. They moved slowly down the walkway, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in bed, clutching my phone even though I knew it wouldn't work. I waited for morning, watching the door like something might come through it at any second. When dawn finally came, I packed my things without even showering. The motel office was empty when I dropped off the key. As I walked back to my car, I glanced toward the far end of the lot. Room 13's door was cracked open, just slightly. I swore I could see someone standing in the shadows inside, watching. I don't like talking about it, but it feels worse keeping it bottled up. Maybe writing it down will help. Or maybe I just need to see the words on paper so I know I'm not losing my mind. It started with a dead phone battery. That's the kind of thing that can happen to anyone, right? I've been driving for hours. My GPS guiding me to some cheap motel just off the highway. I wasn't planning to stay long, just one night, enough to rest up before heading to my friend Mark's place a few states over. I had been needing this trip, a break from work, from everything. I had planned to call Mark once I checked in, let him know I was alive and on schedule, but my phone died about 20 minutes before I reached the place. The charger was back at home, plugged into the wall, forgotten in my rush to leave. I didn't think much of it at first, just inconvenient. The Moonlight Pines Motel wasn't much to look at, the kind of place with faded signs and flickering lights. One of those single-story setups, all the rooms lined up in a neat row facing the parking lot. I'd stayed at worse. There was a flickering yellow vacancy sign that hummed faintly as I pulled into the lot. I could see the office light was on, so I figured it was open. It was late, almost midnight. A little bell jingled when I stepped inside. The air smelled musty like old carpet and stale cigarettes. The guy behind the counter barely looked at me. Late 40s, thin, with sallow skin stretched too tight over his cheekbones. He had a newspaper in front of him, but I doubt he was really reading it. He seemed bored, like he'd been sitting there for hours, waiting for someone to show up. "One night," I said, and slid my card across the counter. He nodded, ran it through the machine, and handed me a key. "Room 9. Park close to the room," he said. "Lot's empty tonight. No one else here." I gave him a nod, more focused on the thought of collapsing into bed. I didn't even notice until I got back to my car that there were no other vehicles. The whole place felt deserted. I chalked it up to bad business. Motels like this probably saw fewer guests every year. Still, I'd be lying if I said the emptiness didn't feel a little strange. Room 9 wasn't much. A bed, an old dresser, and a TV bolted to the wall. The carpet had stains in the corners and the air conditioner rattled, but it was better than sleeping in the car. I tossed my duffel under the chair by the window and sat on the edge of the bed. I remember just sitting there for a while, staring at nothing in particular. I was exhausted, but my brain wouldn't shut off. I wished I could call Mark. It wasn't until I laid down and clicked off the lamp that I noticed it. At first, I thought it was my imagination. A faint sound, distant but constant, like someone dragging something heavy across concrete. I sat up, ears straining. The room was silent aside from the hum of the air conditioner. I lay back down, but then it came again. This time, closer. A soft scrape outside the door. I held my breath. My mind started coming up with explanations. Maybe the wind, maybe a stray animal, maybe that guy at the front desk doing some late-night maintenance. But when I got up and checked through the peephole, there was nothing. Just the empty lot, bathed in pale yellow light. I stood there for a long time before locking the deadbolt and crawling back into bed. I must have drifted off, but something woke me. A sharp knock. 3 loud knocks at the door. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat up, eyes wide in the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. Silence. I approached the door slowly, hesitating with my hand over the knob. Something about it felt wrong. I couldn't explain why. I peered through the peephole again. Nothing. The lot was still empty. I checked the time. 3:07 a.m. Too late for someone to randomly show up. Too early for staff to be making rounds. I went back to bed, this time leaving the lamp on. Morning brought a strange sense of calm. The sunlight filtering through the blinds made the room feel less suffocating. I almost laughed at myself. Exhaustion could make you hear things, right? I packed my stuff and stepped outside, greeted by crisp morning air. I was relieved to see the lot still empty, just like before. I didn't bother checking out, I just left the key on the counter and walked out. But as I got into my car, something caught my eye. Room 9's door was slightly ajar. I swore I'd locked it, deadbolt and all. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I almost went back, but something stopped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still in there. I drove away without looking back. By the time I reached Mark's place, I had convinced myself it was just a bad night at a creepy motel. I didn't even mention it to him. It felt silly, like something out of a campfire story, but later that night, as I lay on the couch in his guest room, I heard it again. A soft scrape against the window and 3 knocks at the door. Room 9 followed me home. I can't explain what drew me to the motel that night. It wasn't on my planned route, and I wasn't the kind of guy to make impulsive stops. But as the rain lashed against my windshield, obscuring the road ahead, the flickering neon sign for Highway Haven Motel felt like salvation. I'd been driving for hours, my body stiff from the long journey. I was relocating for a new job, a fresh start, they said. I'd just finalized a messy divorce, leaving behind a life I no longer recognized. My car was crammed with boxes of belongings, each one a reminder of a failed chapter. As I pulled into the gravel lot, the rain seemed to intensify, hammering against the roof of my car. The motel looked like it hadn't seen renovations since the 82nds. The neon sign buzzed faintly, struggling to stay lit, and the parking lot was deserted except for an old, rusted pickup truck. I grabbed my overnight bag and jogged to the office, dodging puddles. Inside, the smell of mildew and stale coffee hit me immediately. A middle-aged man with greasy hair and a stained shirt sat behind the counter, flipping through a dog-eared magazine. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, trying to sound casual, though the atmosphere was already gnawing at me. He slid a clipboard toward me. "Fill this out, cash only." I frowned but didn't argue. As I handed him the cash, he pushed a key across the counter. Room 6, down the left side. The room was exactly what I expected. Cheap floral bedding, peeling wallpaper, and the faint odor of dampness. A single window overlooked the parking lot, where rain continued to pour relentlessly. I locked the door behind me and set my bag on the bed. Exhausted, I flopped onto the mattress. The springs groaned under my weight. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain, trying to convince myself this was just another stop on my journey, nothing to worry about. But something felt off. Maybe it was the stillness of the place, or the way the wind howled like a wounded animal. I brushed it off as nerves. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. They were slow and deliberate, crunching the gravel just beyond the thin walls of my room. I froze, straining to listen. Then came a knock, soft at first, then more insistent. I stayed silent, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no service. The storm must have knocked out the signal. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I waited another hour, too afraid to move, before finally drifting back to a restless sleep. When I woke again, the digital clock on the nightstand read 3:27 a.m. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I reached for the lamp, but it didn't turn on. The power was out. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. As the beam cut through the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The chair by the window had been moved. It was now positioned directly in front of the door, as if someone had been sitting there, watching. I hadn't moved it. I was sure of that. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I scanned the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but it was empty. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe I had moved it earlier and forgotten. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. By morning, the rain had cleared, and sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy curtains. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. As I stepped outside, the man from the front desk was leaning against the office door, smoking a cigarette. "Sleep well?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "Fine," I lied. He smirked but said nothing more. I drove away, relieved to put the place behind me. But as the miles stretched on, the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched all night, that the footsteps in the chair weren't just figments of my imagination. 2 days later, I was scrolling through my phone during a coffee break when an article caught my eye. Mysterious disappearances linked to Highway Haven Motel. My stomach dropped. The article detailed several cases of travelers who had stayed at the motel and vanished without a trace. Authorities suspected foul play but had no solid leads. The accompanying photo showed the same neon sign, the same decrepit building. I felt sick. I thought about the chair by the door, the footsteps in the night. Had I been moments away from becoming another statistic? I still don't know what kept me safe that night, if anything did. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can hear faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on gravel.